You've seen it 1,000 times. Two knights in gleaming armor, swords clashing repeatedly in a deadly dance, the sharp ring of steel on steel echoing across the battlefield. They circle each other with perfect balance, their movements graceful and dramatic, their armor shining in the sun like mirrors. They fight for minutes, sometimes hours, in movie time, their strength seemingly endless, their technique all sweeping cuts and dramatic parries. One finally breaks through the other's guard with a powerful swing that cuts through armor like it's made of tinfoil, and the defeated knight falls in slow motion, his honor intact, his death noble and clean. It's thrilling. It's beautiful. It's choreographed perfection. And it's almost completely wrong. The knights of medieval Europe, the ones who actually fought in armor, who actually trained for years in combat techniques, who actually faced each other on tournament grounds and battlefields, they fought nothing like what you see in movies. Nothing like the Kingdom of Heaven duels or the Braveheart melees, or even the more historically minded productions that try to get it right but still miss the fundamental truth about armored combat. The real techniques were stranger, more brutal, and infinitely more practical than anything Hollywood has ever shown you. They grappled and wrestled more than they swung swords. They used their swords as hammers, gripping the blade itself with their bare hands. They targeted gaps in armor with surgical precision rather than hacking away at metal plates. They exhausted themselves in 3 to 5 minutes of intense exertion rather than fighting for hours. And most importantly, they were absolutely terrified most of the time because they understood something that movie heroes never seem to grasp. That armor doesn't make you invincible, it just changes how you die. The knights themselves, the historical warriors who lived and fought in the 14th and 15th centuries when plate armor reached its technical peak, left us detailed records of exactly how they fought. Not legends or romanticized chronicles, but actual instruction manuals, step-by-step guides with illustrations showing precise hand positions, body mechanics, and tactical applications. Masters like Fiore de Liberi, who wrote Fiore di Battaglia in 1409, or the anonymous German masters who compiled the Codex Wallenstein, or Hans Talhofer, whose fighting books show not just techniques, but the reality of judicial duels and military combat. These manuals have survived for 600 years, and modern practitioners of historical European martial arts have spent decades testing these techniques with accurate armor reproductions. And what they've discovered is that medieval knights were far more sophisticated, far more practical, and far more brutal than movies have ever portrayed. The elegant sword fighting you see on screen, that's sport fencing from the 18th and 19th centuries, a completely different martial art developed for completely different weapons and purposes. The real medieval combat, the armored fighting that dominated European warfare from roughly 1300 to 1500, was something else entirely. It was wrestling in 60 pounds of steel. It was using every part of your weapon, including parts that seem wrong or dangerous. It was knowing that your opponent was just as well protected as you were. So finesse mattered more than strength, precision mattered more than power, and knowledge of human anatomy mattered more than any amount of raw courage. Tonight, we're going to dismantle every myth you've learned from movies and show you what knightly combat actually looked like, felt like, and why it developed the way it did. We're going to walk through the arming process that took half an hour and required assistance. We're going to learn the techniques that seem counterintuitive until you understand the physics of armored combat. We're going to explore why tournaments were completely different from battlefields, even though knights trained for both. And we're going to meet Sir Edmund Calthorpe, an English knight on the evening of October 24th, 1415, the night before the Battle of Agincourt, as he prepares his equipment and his mind for combat that he knows will be nothing like the glorious tournaments he's won or the idealized chivalric combat he was taught to aspire to as a boy. But first, get comfortable. Seriously. Adjust those pillows, pull up your blanket, maybe turn on your side. Because where we're going, you're going to want to feel the contrast between your safety and warmth, and the cold reality of being encased in metal, knowing that tomorrow you might die in mud while Frenchmen try to find the gaps in your armor with their daggers. The movies make it look glorious. The reality was methodical, exhausting, and absolutely terrifying. So, settle in. Let go of everything Hollywood taught you, and prepare to learn how knights actually fought, which is somehow both more boring and more brutal than any movie has ever dared to show. The tent is cold this October evening, and Sir Edmund Calthorpe sits on a wooden camp stool wearing only his linen braids and shirt, staring at the pieces of his armor laid out on a cloth before him. Each piece has been cleaned and oiled, every strap checked, every buckle tested. His squire, a boy of 15 named Thomas, stands ready to assist with the arming process that will transform Edmund from a man into something that resembles a walking fortress. This is not a quick process. This is not something you do alone. And this is definitely not something that happens in the 30 seconds of screen time that movies usually allocate to armoring sequences. The full arming of a knight in a 15th century plate harness takes between 30 and 45 minutes with experienced help, and it happens in a specific order that cannot be rushed or altered without compromising either protection or mobility. Edmund has done this hundreds of times. He's been a knight for 10 years, trained in arms since he was 7 years old, and the ritual of arming has become as familiar as breathing, but it never becomes casual. Every time you put on armor, you're aware that you're preparing for the possibility of death, and that awareness keeps the process solemn and focused even after a decade of practice. The first piece is not what you'd expect if your knowledge comes from movies. It's not the breastplate or the helmet. It's the arming doublet, a padded garment that Edmund pulls on over his shirt. The doublet is quilted linen stuffed with wool, fitted closely to his body, and critically important for two reasons that movies almost never acknowledge. First, it provides a layer of padding between Edmund's skin and the metal that will soon encase him, preventing the armor from rubbing his skin raw during movement. Second, and more importantly, it has dozens of small metal-tipped laces called points sewn into it at specific locations, and these points will tie the various pieces of armor to the doublet, creating an integrated system where the armor's weight is distributed across Edmund's entire body rather than hanging from a few stress points. This is the secret that movies miss when they show knights clanking around like tin cans. The armor doesn't just sit on top of your clothes. It's tied to a foundation garment in a way that makes it part of your body's structure, distributing 60 to 70 pounds of steel so efficiently that when properly fitted, it feels less like you're carrying weight and more like you've become slightly denser, slightly more substantial, but still fundamentally mobile. Thomas helps Edmund tie the doublet's front lacing, pulling it snug but not tight, ensuring the fit is perfect before they begin adding metal. Next come the sabatons, the armored shoes. These are not the clunky, inflexible foot coverings that movie knights wear. These are articulated pieces of steel shaped precisely to Edmund's feet, connected by small rivets that allow the metal plates to flex and move with each step. Thomas slides them onto Edmund's feet over his regular leather shoes and buckles them at the ankles. Edmund stands, testing the fit, walking a few steps. The sabatons click softly with each movement, but they don't impede his ability to feel the ground beneath him or to move with reasonable agility. The plates overlap like fish scales, providing protection while maintaining flexibility. This same principle, articulation through overlapping plates, is repeated throughout the armor and represents hundreds of years of metallurgical and engineering refinement. Every piece of a knight's armor is designed to protect while allowing movement, and the craftsmanship involved in creating these articulated joints is extraordinary. The armorer who made Edmund's harness spent months on it, heating and hammering steel, creating curves that match Edmund's body, drilling precise holes for rivets, testing each articulation to ensure movement. This is not crude medieval metalwork. This is precision engineering that wouldn't be matched in complexity until the Industrial Revolution. The greaves come next, protecting Edmund's lower legs. These are two pieces of formed steel, one for each shin, that wrap around his legs and buckle on the outside. Thomas fastens them snugly, ensuring they won't shift during movement, but aren't so tight they restrict circulation. Then the powlins, the knee defenses, which are particularly complex pieces. Each polygon consists of a large dome that covers the kneecap, with articulated plates called lames that extend above and below to protect the area where the thigh and shin pieces meet. The engineering here is crucial because the knee is one of the most mobile joints in the body, and protecting it while allowing a full range of motion requires sophisticated design. Edmund bends and straightens his legs several times, testing. The palens move smoothly with his knee, the lames sliding over each other without binding or catching. Good. The cuisses are next, the thigh protectors. These are perhaps the most uncomfortable pieces because they're essentially steel tubes that encase Edmund's thighs from hip to knee. Thomas laces them to the doublet's points at the hips and buckles them at the front and back. When Edmund walks now, he can feel the full weight of the leg armor, maybe 15 pounds total for both legs, but it's balanced weight, distributed evenly, and after a few practice steps his body adjusts and the strangeness fades. Now comes the fouled, the skirt-like piece that protects Edmund's waist and hips. It's made of horizontal steel lames that overlap downward, allowing him to bend at the waist while providing protection to his lower torso and upper thighs. The fold buckles at the sides and hangs from a belt, and its weight rests on Edmund's hips rather than his shoulders. Another example of how proper armor distributes load across the entire body structure. The breastplate is next, and this is the piece movies always show first. Edmund's breastplate is a single piece of steel, slightly convex, shaped to deflect blows rather than absorb them directly. The physics here are important and almost never explained correctly in films. Armor doesn't stop weapons by being thick enough to resist cutting or crushing. Good armor stops weapons by presenting angled surfaces that redirect force away from the body. Edmund's breastplate has a pronounced central ridge that causes incoming blows to glance left or right rather than transferring their full force into his chest. The shape is as important as the thickness. Thomas lifts the breastplate and holds it against Edmund's chest while Edmund threads his arms through the straps. The breast and back plates connect at the shoulders and sides with leather straps and buckles. When Thomas finishes fastening everything, Edmund is wearing a steel shell over his entire torso, front and back, that weighs about 25 pounds but feels significantly less because the weight rests on his hips and shoulders simultaneously. The placard comes next, an additional plate that covers the lower half of the breastplate and the upper fold, providing double protection to the abdomen where a strike could be particularly devastating. Then the tassets, hanging plates that protect the upper thighs and attach to the fold with leather straps, providing coverage that overlaps with the cuisses. Every piece overlaps with the pieces above and below it, creating a continuous shell of steel, with no gaps large enough for a weapon to penetrate directly. The arm harnesses are complex assemblies that take several minutes each to attach. They start with the counters, the elbow defenses, which like the palens are articulated to allow joint movement, then the vam braces for the forearms, and rear braces for the upper arms, each laced to the doublet's points. The pauldrons, the shoulder defenses, are the largest and most elaborate pieces of the arm harness. Edmund's pauldrons are asymmetrical. The left is larger and more protective because it faces toward an opponent in a standard fighting stance, while the right is smaller to allow better mobility for weapon use. This asymmetry is historically accurate but almost never appears in movies, where matching armor looks more aesthetically pleasing to modern eyes. The pauldrons attach to the breast and back plates with straps and also laced to the doublet, And when everything is properly fastened, Edmund can raise his arms above his head, lower them to his sides, reach across his body, and perform any normal arm movement with only slight restriction. The gauntlets are works of art. Each consists of dozens of small steel plates riveted together to create fully articulated steel gloves. Edmund can make a fist, spread his fingers, grip a weapon, manipulate buckles, and straps. Everything a bare hand can do, his gauntleted hands can also do, just with slightly less tactile sensitivity. The popular image of knights unable to pick up small objects or requiring help to do simple tasks is completely false. Edmund could write with a quill pen while wearing these gauntlets if he needed to. The fingertip plates are shaped to match his fingertips exactly, and the palm plates are smooth to allow proper weapon grip. Thomas helps Edmund pull on the gauntlets and buckle them at the wrists. Finally, the helmet. Edmund's helmet is a bassinet, a pointed helmet with a movable visor. The helmet fits over a padded coif that protects his head and neck. When Thomas lowers the visor, Edmund's field of vision narrows dramatically. This is one of the few areas where movies are actually accurate about armor's limitations. The visor has a narrow horizontal slit for vision and small holes for breathing, but Edmund's peripheral vision is almost completely eliminated and sounds become muffled. This is perhaps the most psychologically challenging aspect of armored combat. You're isolated inside a steel shell, your senses diminished, unable to see threats from the side or hear warnings clearly. It requires enormous trust in your fellow soldiers and constant head movement to scan your surroundings. Edmund is now fully armored, and the entire process has taken 32 minutes. He stands and moves around the tent, testing everything. He bends at the waist to touch his toes easily. He drops to one knee, and standing back up requires some effort, but entirely possible. He reaches behind his head. The pauldrons restrict this somewhat, but he can still manage it. The armor doesn't prevent this, though landing in 65 pounds of steel is noticeably harder than landing unarmored. Movies would have you believe that knights in armor were slow, clumsy, and nearly immobile. The truth, proven by modern experimenters wearing accurate armor reproductions, is that a fit man in well-fitted armor can run, jump, climb, mount a horse without assistance, and even perform acrobatic movements like forward rolls and cartwheels. The armor restricts movement less than you'd think and far less than movies portray. What it does restrict is endurance. Everything you do in armor requires more effort than doing it unarmored. Your muscles work harder to move the additional weight. Your body heats up more quickly because the steel traps your body heat and the padding prevents cooling. You consume more oxygen because every breath has to expand your chest against the constriction of the breastplate. You can move normally in armor, but you can't move normally for very long. 3 to 5 minutes of intense combat in full harness will exhaust even the fittest warrior. And this exhaustion factor is perhaps the most important reality that movies ignore. Edmund sits back down, still fully armored, and Thomas brings him water. Drinking in armor is difficult but possible. Edmund lifts his visor and drinks from a leather flask. This is another detail movies get wrong. Knights didn't keep their visors down constantly. In camp, during marches, any time when immediate combat wasn't expected, visors stayed up to allow better vision, hearing, and breathing. You only lowered your visor when fighting was imminent, and you raised it again as soon as possible because the sensory deprivation is genuinely unpleasant. Edmund thinks about tomorrow's battle while he sits in his armor, letting his body adjust to the weight and restriction. He's fought in 3 previous battles and numerous tournaments. He knows the difference between tournament fighting and battlefield fighting, and he knows which one tomorrow will be. In tournaments, there are rules. Weapons are blunted, strikes to certain areas are forbidden, marshals stop the fight if someone is seriously hurt. Tournament fighting is still dangerous. Knights die in tournaments regularly, but it's controlled danger, structured violence with referees and medical attention immediately available. Battlefield fighting has no rules, no referees, No moment when someone stops the fight to check if you're okay. Battlefield fighting is about killing the enemy as efficiently as possible using whatever technique works, and whatever technique works against an armored opponent looks nothing like the dramatic sword fighting in movies. Before we go deeper into those techniques, into the strange and brutal reality of how armored knights actually fought each other, I want to ask you something. If you're finding this interesting, if learning the reality behind the movies is helping you relax and fall asleep, do me a favor and hit that like button. And if you want more of these myth-busting deep dives into historical reality, subscribe to the channel. I make these regularly, taking topics you think you understand and showing you what the historical evidence actually says. Comments also help tremendously, so if you want, tell me. What's the biggest myth about medieval combat you've believed? What movie got it most wrong? I'm genuinely curious what misconceptions are most widespread. Alright, now let's get into the techniques themselves. Let's learn how Edmund and his fellow knights actually used their weapons when fighting in armor, and I promise you, it's going to seem completely wrong at first because Hollywood has taught us that swords are used one way when the reality is far stranger and far more practical. Thomas helps Edmund remove the armor now because wearing it continuously is unnecessarily exhausting. Tomorrow morning, 3 hours before the battle, Edmund will arm again, but tonight he needs to review the techniques, practice the movements, and remind his body of the training that might keep him alive when French knights are trying to kill him. And the first technique he'll practice is one that looks absolutely insane if you don't understand armored combat: gripping his sword by the blade. Edmund stands in the training yard area of the English camp, now wearing just his doublet and hose, sword in hand. The sword is not the elegant, light weapon movies often portray. It's a long sword, about 3.5 feet of blade, weighing approximately 3 pounds, with a long grip that allows two-handed use and a crossguard wide enough to protect the hands. What Edmund does next would get him laughed out of any movie production because it looks fundamentally wrong to modern eyes that have been trained by hundreds of films showing proper sword technique. He grips the sword's blade with his left hand, about halfway down its length, while his right hand remains on the grip. He's holding the sharp edge of the blade with his bare hand, and he's doing it deliberately, carefully, but without any apparent concern about cutting himself. This technique is called half-swording, and it's one of the most important techniques in armored combat, documented extensively in medieval fighting manuals and completely absent from almost every movie ever made about knights. The reason Edmund can grip the blade safely is partly technique and partly physics. He's not sliding his hand along the edge, which would indeed cut him. He's gripping the flat of the blade firmly, and as long as the grip is secure and he doesn't let the blade slide through his hand, the pressure is distributed over enough surface area that the edge doesn't cut through his skin. It's the same principle that lets you press your hand against a knife blade without cutting yourself, as long as you don't drag your hand along the edge. But why would you grip your sword this way? Because in armored combat, the sword stops being primarily a cutting weapon and becomes a precision thrusting weapon. When your opponent is wearing 60 pounds of articulated steel plate, you can't cut through his armor. It's not possible. Movie swords that slice through armor are pure fantasy. Real swords, even very sharp swords wielded by very strong men, cannot cut through properly made plate armor. The steel is too thick, too hard, too well designed to deflect cutting blows. So if you can't cut your opponent, what do? You thrust at the gaps in his armor. You aim for the visor slit, the armpit gap, the back of the knee, the inside of the elbow, the groin area where the faults and creases meet, anywhere that articulation requires a small opening. And to make these precise thrusts, you need control that you can't achieve with a normal sword grip. When you grip the blade itself with your forward hand, you transform your sword from a cutting implement into a short spear. The half-sword grip gives you leverage to thrust with enormous force, control to aim at small targets, and the ability to manipulate the point with precision that's impossible when you're holding only the grip. Edmund practices the basic half-sword thrust, the technique called threading the needle in some manuals. He assumes a fighting stance, both hands on the blade now, the pommel braced against his right hip, the point aimed forward at head height. From this position, he can thrust straight ahead with the full power of his body behind the point, driving the sword tip through a visor slit or into an armpit gap with enough force to penetrate the mail shirt that typically protects these vulnerable areas. The technique looks nothing like movie sword fighting. There are no sweeping cuts, no dramatic parries with blades sliding along each other making dramatic sounds. Edmund's movements are compact, controlled, focused entirely on driving the point into small targets. He practices against an armored dummy that his master-at-arms has set up, a wooden post wearing an old harness with the vulnerable points marked. Edmund moves through the basic sequences. Thrust to the visor, withdraw, thrust to the armpit, withdraw, thrust to the groin, withdraw. Each thrust is accompanied by a short step and a full body drive that puts his weight behind the point. The dummy stands impassive and undamaged because Edmund is using a blunted training sword, but in real combat, these thrusts would be lethal. A sword point, driven through a visor slit, penetrates the eye and brain. A thrust into the armpit cuts the major blood vessels that serve the arm and can reach the heart if driven deep enough. A groin thrust severs the femoral artery and causes death from blood loss in minutes. This is the reality of armored combat that movies almost never show. It's not about powerful strikes that knock people down. It's about precise attacks on specific vulnerable points. It's surgery, not butchery. It requires extensive anatomical knowledge, years of practice, and the ability to execute techniques perfectly while exhausted, terrified, and being attacked by someone trying to do the same thing to you. But half-swording is just one technique. Edmund transitions to practicing what the German masters call the Mordhau, which translates roughly to murder stroke. This technique is even stranger looking than half-swording, and even more effective against armored opponents. Edmund reverses his grip on the sword completely, holding it by the blade with both hands so that the pommel and crossguard are facing forward like a warhammer. This is not accidental or desperate. This is a deliberate, documented technique for defeating armor. When you can't cut through a plate and your opponent's visor is closed, so you can't thrust into it easily, you use your sword as a hammer. The pommel of a medieval sword is heavy, often weighing a pound or more, and it's designed to be roughly spherical, or flanged specifically so it can be used this way. The crossguard adds additional striking surface and weight. When you grip the blade and swing the pommel like a hammer, you're creating a weapon that can deliver crushing blows to the head, denting helmets, causing concussions, and if you strike repeatedly, eventually caving in the helmet entirely. Edmund practices Mordhau strikes against a wooden pell, a training post. He grips his sword by the blade, raises it above his head, and brings the pommel down with full force. The impact makes a solid thunk. He repeats the motion, getting his body mechanics right, making sure his hands are positioned correctly on the blade so they won't slip during the strike. This is how knights actually dealt with opponents in closed helmets. Not by cutting through the helmet, which is impossible. Not by thrusting into small gaps, which is difficult when the visor is closed. But by treating their sword as a hammer and beating their opponent's head until the helmet failed or the man inside lost consciousness. The next technique Edmund practices is even further from anything movies show. It's pure grappling, wrestling techniques applied to armored combat. When two armored knights close with each other, when half-swording thrusts have been blocked or parried, when Mordhau strikes have been evaded, the fight almost inevitably goes to the ground. Wrestling is not a desperate fallback in armored combat. Wrestling is the foundation. Medieval fighting manuals, the ones written by actual masters-at-arms who trained actual knights, devote enormous sections to wrestling techniques, to throws and locks and takedowns, because they understood that most armored fights would end in a grapple. Edmund practices a basic takedown called the murder strike entry to the cross in Fiore's system. He approaches the dummy in half-sword position as if preparing to thrust. Then, in one fluid motion, he reverses his sword to mortal grip, steps close to the dummy, hooks his right arm around the dummy's head, and uses his body weight to pull the dummy backward while simultaneously sweeping its leg. If this were a real opponent, they would now be on the ground with Edmund on top of them, and the fight would be over moments later when Edmund drove his rondel dagger through a gap in the armor. The dagger is the actual killing weapon in most knight versus knight combat. Swords are for creating openings, for controlling distance, for threatening thrusts that keep your opponent cautious. But daggers, specifically the narrow armor-piercing rondel daggers that every knight carries, are for finishing fights. Once you had your opponent on the ground, once you're on top of them and they can't easily rise under the weight of their armor, you take out your dagger and you find a gap. You work the point under the edge of their helmet or into their armpit, or you flip up their visor and thrust directly into their face. This is how most armored combat ends, not with dramatic final sword strokes, but with desperate wrestling followed by methodical dagger work. Edmund practices these techniques for an hour, running through the sequences until his muscles remember them without conscious thought. This is not new training. Edmund learned these techniques as a boy squire, refined them over years of practice, and used them in tournaments and battles. But practice must be constant, because the techniques are complex and because in combat, when your body is flooded with fear and adrenaline, you will revert to whatever your muscles know automatically. Conscious thought is too slow in a fight. Your hands must know what to do without your mind directing them. This is why knights trained constantly, why boys began weapons training at age 7 and continued daily for their entire fighting careers. The techniques themselves are not particularly difficult to learn. A modern practitioner of historical European martial arts can become competent in basic half-swording and mordhau techniques in a few months of regular practice. But competence and mastery are different. Executing techniques perfectly while exhausted, while afraid, while being attacked, while wearing armor that restricts your breathing and vision, that requires years of training and vision, that requires years of training and regular practice to maintain. Edmund's master-at-arms, an older knight named Sir William, who no longer fights in battles but trains the younger men, approaches and watches Edmund practice. William carries a blunted longsword and signals that he wants to spar. This is valuable because practicing against a static dummy is fundamentally different from practicing against an opponent who fights back. Edmund and William both retrieve their training armor, lighter and less complete than battle armor, but sufficient for practice, and face each other in the training yard. They begin carefully, testing each other, both in half-sword positions, because they're simulating armored combat. William feints a thrust at Edmund's visor, and Edmund responds by parrying with his blade while simultaneously stepping offline and attempting a counter-thrust at William's armpit. William blocks by dropping his arm, trapping Edmund's blade against his body, and suddenly they're grappling, each trying to control the other's weapon and body. This is what real armored combat looks like. Not the distance fighting of movie duels with opponents circling and exchanging strikes from arm's length. Armored combat happens at wrestling distance, with bodies pressed together, weapons trapped between bodies, each fighter trying to throw the other or create space for a killing thrust. The bout lasts approximately 3 minutes, which doesn't sound long but is absolutely exhausting when you're fighting in armor. Edmund and William break apart by mutual agreement, both breathing hard, both drenched in sweat despite the October cold. 3 minutes of armored combat, even practice combat with blunted weapons and pulled strikes, is more exhausting than most people can imagine. Your entire body is engaged continuously. Your legs drive you forward and maintain balance. Your core stabilizes your body and generates power for strikes. Your arms manipulate your weapon and grapple with your opponent. Your mind tracks your opponent's position, your own position, your weapon position, available targets, threats, opportunities. And you're doing all of this while breathing through a narrow slit in a helmet, while your vision is restricted, while 65 pounds of armor makes every movement require extra effort, while the padding traps your body heat and your temperature rises toward dangerous levels. 5 minutes of maximum intensity armored combat will drop even the fittest fighter to the ground from exhaustion. This is why movie fight scenes that show knights fighting for 15 or 20 minutes straight are not just unrealistic, they're physically impossible. William gives Edmund advice about his footwork, about a moment when Edmund's stance was too wide and William could have swept his leg, about how Edmund's half-sword thrusts are technically correct but lack the explosive power that comes from full hip rotation. This feedback is valuable, the kind of refinement that only comes from an experienced master watching your technique. Edmund thanks William and continues practicing alone, working specifically on the hip rotation that William identified as weak. The sun is setting now, and tomorrow morning he'll wake before dawn, arm himself, and march to a battlefield where French knights will try to kill him using these same techniques that he's practicing. The thought creates a cold knot in his stomach that has nothing to do with the October weather. Fear is perhaps the most absent element in movie depictions of knightly combat. Movie knights fight with confidence, with anger, with determination, but rarely with the cold, gut-wrenching fear that actual warriors felt. Edmund is afraid. He's been in battles before, and he's always afraid beforehand. The fear doesn't disappear during combat, it just gets masked by adrenaline and the immediate demands of survival. But right now, the night before battle, the fear is clear and present, and Edmund uses his practice to manage it. Physical activity helps. Reviewing techniques helps. Reminding himself that he's trained for this, that he knows what to do, that he's survived before. All of this helps manage the fear without eliminating it, because the fear is rational. Tomorrow, skilled men will try. His armor will protect him from many attacks, but not all. His skill will save him from many situations, but not all. And luck, pure chance, will play a role that no amount of training or Edmund thinks about tournaments as he practices, about the stark difference between tournament fighting and battlefield fighting. In tournaments, when you unhorse an opponent or throw them to the ground, marshals immediately intervene. The fight stops. You don't continue attacking a downed opponent. You don't take out your dagger and kill them. Tournament fighting is about demonstrating skill, winning honor, and yes, sometimes serious injury or death occurs, but it's accidental rather than intentional. Battlefield fighting has no such constraints. On the battlefield, when you put an opponent on the ground, that's when the real killing begins. You don't let them stand back up. You don't give them a chance to recover. You get on top of them, hold them down, and you murder them methodically with your dagger, or you signal for your companions to help hold them while you work your blade into armor gaps. Or, if the opponent is wealthy enough to ransom you, beat them unconscious and take them prisoner. But that calculation happens in the moment, based on what armor they wear, what heraldry they display, what languages they speak when they beg for mercy. Edmund has killed 2 men in his previous battles, both times in exactly this way, wrestling them to the ground and finishing them with his dagger. He remembers both kills clearly. The first was a French knight at the Battle of Shrewsbury. Edmund had unhorsed him with a lance strike, then dismounted and engaged on foot. They grappled, Edmund got him down, and then there was the terrible intimacy of sitting on a man's chest, looking into his eyes through his visor slit, seeing the fear there and working a dagger blade up under his helmet rim until the man stopped struggling. The second was a Scots knight in a border skirmish. Similar circumstances, except that man fought harder on the ground, and Edmund needed help from 2 other English soldiers to hold him down, while Edmund found the armpit gap. Both men died slowly, bleeding internally, drowning in their own blood, and both made sounds that Edmund still hears sometimes when he's trying to fall asleep. This is the reality that movies sanitize or ignore. Armored combat is not clean or quick or particularly noble. It's brutal, intimate violence. You're close enough to your opponent to smell them, to hear their breathing, to look into their eyes. You're not striking from distance with a sword that magically kills on contact. You're wrestling with another human being, both of you encased in steel, both exhausted and terrified, and eventually one of you will end up on the ground, and the other will kill them with a foot of sharpened steel pushed through a gap in their armor. The killing itself often takes time. Dagger wounds to the torso cause death from bleeding or organ damage, but not instantly. Men with daggers in their lungs can continue fighting for minutes, drowning in their own blood but still conscious, still trying to kill you. Men with daggers in their abdomen can survive for hours with proper medical attention, though they usually die from infection days later even if the initial wound is treated. Only strikes to the brain cause instant death, and driving a dagger through a visor slit into a man's eye and brain requires precision that's difficult to achieve when both of you are moving and struggling. This is why battles, even battles where one side is clearly defeated, take hours to finish. The actual killing is labor-intensive work. After the French cavalry broke at Shrewsbury, after they turned and ran, English soldiers spent 2 hours pursuing and killing the routing French, not because the French fought back, but because killing an armored man takes time and effort even when he's surrendering or running away. You have to catch him, wrestle him down, work your blade into an armor gap, and then move on to the next one. It's exhausting, grim work, and Edmund has nightmares about it regularly. Edmund sheaths his sword and removes his practice armor. His muscles ache pleasantly from the exertion, and he's tired in a way that might let him sleep, despite his fear. Thomas appears with bread and cheese and watered wine, and Edmund eats mechanically, fueling his body for tomorrow's ordeal. Around him, the English camp is settling for the night. Fires burn low. Men talk quietly, check their equipment, pray, write letters they hope won't become their last letters. The English army is outnumbered at least 3-1 by the French force that waits across the muddy fields. Edmund knows the odds. Everyone knows the odds. The French have more knights, better equipment, and they're fighting on home territory with supply lines intact, while the English are at the end of a long, exhausting campaign through France. By any reasonable calculation, the English will be destroyed tomorrow. But Edmund also knows that battles are not decided purely by numbers. Terrain matters, tactics matter, morale matters, and perhaps most importantly, the specific skills and techniques that soldiers bring to battle matter. The French knights are trained in the same basic techniques that Edmund practices, the same half-swording and mordhouse strikes and wrestling. But Edmund has heard that many French knights still train primarily for tournaments, that they emphasize the glory and pageantry of combat more than the brutal pragmatism required for battlefield survival. He's heard that French knights often refuse to fight on foot, considering dismounted combat beneath their dignity, preferring to fight mounted even in situations where horses are at a tactical disadvantage. He doesn't know if these rumors are true. He'll find out tomorrow. Edmund's thoughts turn to a tournament he won 3 years ago. A grand tournament at Westminster where he unhorsed 4 opponents in the joust and won the mounted melee. That tournament was glorious. The crowds cheering, the heralds announcing his name, the prize money that bought him new armor, the respect from other knights, the favor from a lady whose name he won't think about now because that memory is too complicated and painful. Tournament fighting at its best felt like everything knighthood was supposed to be. Skill and courage displayed before an appreciative audience, victory bringing honor rather than just survival, violence contained within rules that prevented it from becoming mere slaughter. Edmund loved tournaments. He was good at them. He won more than he lost, earned good money from prizes and ransoms, built a reputation as a skilled and honorable fighter, but tournaments, he knows, are not real combat. They're a game, a sophisticated and dangerous game, but still fundamentally different from warfare. In tournaments, you fight individuals. On battlefields, you fight in formation, surrounded by your companions facing a mass of enemies. In tournaments, you know your opponent's name and lineage. On battlefields, you kill strangers whose faces you never see clearly. In tournaments, you use blunted weapons and pull your strikes. On battle, the skills translate partially, balance timing, distance management, reading an opponent's intentions, but the psychology is completely different. Tournament fighting is a sport. Battlefield fighting is murder. Edmund tries to sleep, but can't. He lies on his bedroll, listening to the camp sounds, running through techniques in his mind, checking his equipment one more time even though he's checked it 5 times already, trying not to think about the fact that tomorrow night he might be dead or crippled or captured or wandering the battlefield with a head wound that will kill him slowly over the next few days. This is the experience that movies almost never portray. The anticipation, the fear, the long night before battle when you have nothing to do except wait and think and try to manage your terror. Movie nights wake up, arm themselves and fight, all in a compressed time frame that eliminates the psychological torment of waiting. But real warriors, Edmund included, spend hours or days in anticipation, and that anticipation is often worse than the battle itself. In battle, you're too busy to be afraid in the reflective, contemplative way that you're afraid now. In battle, fear becomes adrenaline, narrowed focus, hyper-awareness of immediate threats. But now, lying in darkness, Edmund's fear has space to expand and fill his consciousness. He thinks about dying. He thinks about being wounded and crippled, spending the rest of his life begging because he can't work. He thinks about being captured and ransomed, bankrupting his family to buy his freedom. He thinks about killing, about adding more faces to the collection of faces that visit his nightmares. He prays, not eloquent formal prayers, but simple, desperate requests. Let me survive. Let me not shame myself. Let me do my duty. Let me come home. Eventually, after what feels like hours but might be less, Edmund falls into fitful sleep, and his dreams are filled with the sounds of battle and the faces of the men he's killed. Edmund wakes in darkness to the sound of camp stirring. October 25th, 1415, the feast of Saints Crispin and Crispinian. Though Edmund doubts the saints are paying much attention to the muddy fields of northern France where 20,000 men are about to try to kill each other. He slept perhaps 2 hours total, fragmentary sleep interrupted by dreams and the sounds of other men moving in the darkness. Now it's time to prepare, to arm, to march to the position King Henry has selected for the English line. Edmund rises stiffly, his muscles tight from yesterday's practice and from sleeping in armor the past 3 weeks on campaign. He drinks water and forces himself to eat bread, even though his stomach is clenched tight with fear. Food is fuel. His body will need energy today, more energy than any tournament ever demanded, and he has to eat despite not wanting to. Thomas appears with the armor, and they begin the arming process for the second time in 12 hours. This time there's no practice, no testing movements, just efficient execution of the ritual. Each piece goes on in order: doublet, sabatons, greaves, paulins, cuisses, fold, breastplate, backplate, placard, tassets, vambraces, rebraces, couters, pauldrons, gauntlets. The helmet Edmund will carry until the battle is imminent. The arming takes 28 minutes, faster than last night because both Edmund and Thomas know exactly what they're doing, and there's no time for careful adjustment. The fit is good enough. It will have to be. Edmund straps on his sword belt, hangs his long sword on his left hip and his rondel dagger on his right. He picks up his poleaxe, the weapon he'll actually use in the battle if he can. The places a 6-foot staff with an axe blade on one side of the head, a hammer on the other, and a spike on top. It's the premier weapon for armored foot combat, superior to a sword in almost every situation except very close grappling. The axe blade can hook limbs and necks. The hammer can crush helmets. The spike can pierce armor with direct thrusts. and the long shaft gives a reach advantage over sword-armed opponents. The English army forms up as dawn breaks grey and cold over the battlefield. Edmund takes his position in the men-at-arms formation, surrounded by other knights and professional soldiers, all on foot despite being trained as cavalry. King Henry has ordered all the nobility to fight dismounted, to stand in line with the common soldiers, to present a unified defensive front. This is unusual. This is not how French knights fight. The French believe cavalry is the queen of the battlefield, that mounted knights charging in formation are unstoppable, that fighting on foot is something you do only if you're unhorsed accidentally. But Henry has studied the terrain, has seen the narrow field flanked by woods, and has calculated that the mud from recent rains will slow cavalry charges and break their formation. So the English will fight on foot, in a dense formation 3 or 4 ranks deep, with archers on both flanks and clear lines of retreat behind them. Edmund stands in the second rank, his poleaxe grounded, his helmet not yet on because Henry wants the men to see each other's faces, to remember they're fighting for England, for each other, for their survival. The French army is visible across the field, maybe 300 or 400 yards away, and even from this distance Edmund can see they outnumber the English dramatically. The French have thousands of mounted knights in glittering armor, more thousands of foot soldiers behind them, crossbowmen's artillery, supply wagons stretching back into the distance. The English have maybe 6,000 men total, most of them archers, maybe 1,000 men-at-arms like Edmund. The odds are terrible. The situation is terrible. The English are exhausted from the campaign, sick from dysentery, low on supplies, far from home. By every reasonable military calculation, they should surrender or negotiate. But Henry isn't negotiating. Henry has chosen this battlefield carefully and is betting everything on terrain, tactics, and the devastating power of the English longbow. Edmund watches the French formations across the field and remembers the tournament at Westminster 3 years ago, remembers how different that violence was from what's about to happen here. The tournament began with a ceremony, with heralds announcing participants, with ladies giving favors to their chosen knights, with musicians playing and crowds cheering. Everything was pageantry and display. Edmund's armor was polished to mirror brightness, decorated with his family's heraldry, designed as much to impress as to protect. His horse wore caparison bearing the same heraldry, silk and wool in his family colors. The weapons for the joust were specialized tournament lances, designed to shatter on impact rather than penetrate, to demonstrate force without causing lethal injury. The first pass of the joust, Edmund and his opponent, Sir Richard Beaumont, thundered toward each other in the lists, the narrow lanes that kept horses running straight, and the impact when their lances struck each other's shields was tremendous but controlled. Both lances shattered into dramatic fragments, and the crowd cheered the successful passers. Neither knight was injured. The lances were designed to break in exactly that spectacular but relatively safe way. They ran 4 more passes, and on the 5th, Edmund's lance struck Richard's helmet squarely and lifted him from his saddle. Richard fell hard, the impact surely bruising despite his armor, but the sand in the lists cushioned his fall, and marshals rushed to assist him. The fall wasn't deliberate. Edmund wasn't trying to hurt Richard, but in the joust, unhorsing your opponent is victory, so Edmund had won the bout. Richard rose, raised his visor, and saluted Edmund with good grace. They would drink together that evening and laugh about the fall. The tournament melee that afternoon was equally controlled, despite appearing chaotic. 30 knights divided into 2 teams fought in a large roped enclosure, with marshals watching carefully to ensure no one violated the rules. The weapons were blunted swords and poleaxes. Strikes to the head were permitted but had to be controlled. Strikes to the horse were absolutely forbidden and would result in immediate disqualification and possible ban from future tournaments. The objective was to either unhorse opponents or force them to yield by sustained attack. Edmund's team fought as a coordinated unit, supporting each other, protecting unhorsed teammates, focusing attacks on isolated opponents. Edmund himself unhorsed 2 opponents and forced a third to yield after sustained police strikes to his helmet made it clear Edmund had him beaten. The entire melee lasted perhaps 20 minutes before marshals ended it and declared Edmund's team victorious. Edmund was exhausted, bruised under his armor, exhilarated by the combat and the victory. The prizes were good: money, a decorated sword, and most valuable, reputation. Edmund's name was announced as champion of the melee, and that evening at the feast other knights sought his company. Lords mentioned opportunities for service, and Lady Catherine, whose name Edmund still doesn't want to think about, gave him her favor and suggested a meeting later that developed into a brief, intense, and ultimately painful relationship that Edmund ended when he took service with King Henry's household knights. The tournament was everything Edmund had been taught to aspire to as a knight. It was glory, honor, skill, recognition, all wrapped in pageantry that made the violence acceptable, even beautiful. It was why boys trained to become knights, why families spent fortunes on equipment and training, why the whole social structure of knighthood persisted despite the enormous cost. Tournaments gave meaning to the violence, transformed killing techniques into sport, made knights feel like they were something more than just professional killers serving their lords. But Edmund knows that what's about to happen here at Agincourt is not a tournament. This is war. This is the violence that tournaments dress up and sanitize, return to its raw, purposeful form. The French across the field are not opponents to defeat in honorable combat. They're enemies to kill before they kill you. There are no marshals to stop the fight if it goes too far. There are no rules about where you can strike. There are no prizes for victory except survival. And most importantly, there's no underlying assumption of shared chivalric values that makes tournament combat feel like a game among peers. The French knights over there would torture and kill English prisoners if it served their purposes. The English would do the same. Chivalry, the elaborate code of knightly conduct that governs tournaments and theoretically governs warfare, functions only when both sides agree to honor it, and in actual battles between nations, chivalry is often the first casualty. Edmund has seen prisoners executed after battles when keeping them was inconvenient. He's seen wounded enemies killed rather than treated because treating them required resources the victors didn't want to spare. He's seen towns sacked and populations massacred after sieges, despite promises of mercy made before surrender. The reality of war is that might makes right, and all the chivalric poetry in the world doesn't change the fact that when two armies meet, the fundamental question is who can kill more effectively, not who can fight most honorably. The French begin their advance around mid-morning, and Edmund lowers his visor and grips his place tighter. The French cavalry comes first, thousands of mounted knights in glittering armor, their horses caparisoned beautifully, their lances couched, advancing in waves across the muddy field. It's magnificent and terrible. It looks unstoppable. It looks exactly like what Edmund saw in tournaments. That moment when mounted knights charged in formation, the ground shaking with the thunder of hooves. But this field is not a tournament ground. The field is narrow, constrained by woods on both sides, which channels the French cavalry into a compressed frontage. The field is muddy, which robs the horses of their footing and their speed. And most critically, the field is covered by English longbowmen, thousands of them, each capable of losing 10 or 12 arrows per minute, and longbow arrows fired from a 100-pound draw-weight bow can kill horses at 200 yards. The English archers let the French advance to about 100 yards, and then they released. The sound is like wind, like a flock of massive birds taking flight, thousands of arrows rising in a dark cloud and then descending on the French cavalry. Horses go down screaming. Knights tumble from saddles as the formation fractures as horses swerve to avoid fallen animals and riders struggle to control terrified mounts. The first wave of French cavalry never reaches the English line. They break up in confusion in the middle of the field, some knights trying to continue the charge on dying horses, others thrown to the mud, others wheeling back in panic, and the arrows keep coming, wave after wave, a continuous storm of steel-tipped shafts that turns the battlefield into a killing ground. Edmund watches from behind his visor, his view limited to what he can see through the narrow eye slit, and what he can see is chaos. The French cavalry that survives the arrow storm reaches the English line, and individual knights crash into the formation of men-at-arms. This is nothing like the organized charges of tournaments. This is panicked horses driven into a wall of armed men, with riders trying desperately to strike at enemies while controlling terrified mounts. Edmund uses his policy length to stay out of immediate danger, while striking at horses and riders. He hooks a horse's foreleg with his axe blade and pulls, sending the animal tumbling. The rider crashes to the mud, and English soldiers swarm him immediately. Edmund moves to engage another mounted knight, but that knight is already falling, 3 arrows in his horse's chest. The animal goes down thrashing, and the rider is thrown forward into the English line, where poleaxes and swords immediately end him. This continues for what feels like hours, but is probably 15 or 20 minutes. French cavalry attacks break against the English formation like waves against rocks. The archers kill horses faster than the French can advance them. The narrow field prevents the French from using their numerical advantage. The mud robs their charge of momentum, and the English men-at-arms fighting in tight formation support each other and cut down any French knights who penetrate the line. Edmund kills 3 men in this phase of the battle, though he'll never know their names, or whether they died from his strikes or from the strikes of the soldiers around him. 1 knight on a wounded horse came within reach of Edmund's place, and Edmund drove the spike through the visor slit into the man's face. The knight fell backward off his horse, dead before he hit the ground. Another knight, unhorsed and trying to rise from the mud, received Edmund's hammer spike to the back of his helmet, denting the steel and likely fracturing his skull. The man collapsed face first into the mud and didn't move again. A third knight, on foot and armed with a sword, engaged Edmund directly in the press of bodies, and they fought with techniques Edmund practiced yesterday, half-swording, grappling, struggling for position. Edmund managed to trip the knight, and once he was down, English soldiers held him while Edmund worked his rondel dagger under the man's aventail and into his throat. The knight made choking sounds and died slowly, blood filling his mouth and lungs. The French cavalry assault ends in complete failure, and now the French men-at-arms advance on foot, thousands of them, determined to reach the English line and engage directly where their superior numbers should prevail. But they have to advance through the mud, through the bodies of their own cavalry, through the continuous arrow storm that the English archers maintain. Arrows don't penetrate good plate armor at longer ranges, but they don't have to kill to be effective. Arrows strike knights in the arms, legs, joints where mail protects but plate doesn't cover. Arrows hit faces of knights whose visors are raised because they need to breathe after walking in armor through mud. Arrows kill or wound enough men that the French formation fragments, loses cohesion, arrives at the English line already exhausted and disorganized. And then the real killing begins. The English men-at-arms, fresh and fighting from a stable defensive position, meet the exhausted, disorganized French, and the battle becomes what Edmund knows best: close quarters, armored combat using all the techniques he's practiced his entire adult life. Edmund's place is supremely effective in this environment. The long shaft gives him reach to strike enemies before they can close with him. The spike on top is perfect for thrusting into armor gaps. The hammer is devastating against helmets. The axe blade hooks legs and arms and can trip opponents or pull them into positions where other English soldiers can finish them. Edmund fights in a state that's beyond fear, beyond thought, pure. A French knight swings a mace at Edmund's head. Edmund raises his poleaxe shaft to block, feels the impact shudder through his arms, rotates the weapon and drives the spike at the knight's visor, missing but forcing the knight to flinch backward, which gives the English soldier next to Edmund an opening to hook the knight's leg and bring him down. Down means multiple English soldiers pile on, holding limbs, looking for gaps, stabbing with daggers until the struggling stops. The French keep coming, more men than Edmund can count, and the English line holds because the French can't bring their numbers to bear in the narrow field. They arrive tired and bunched up, and the English methodically cut them down. Edmund loses track of time, loses track of how many men he's killed or helped kill, loses track of everything except the immediate demands of survival. Strike, block, grapple, stab, move, strike again. His arms burn with exhaustion. His lungs burn trying to pull enough air through his helmet's breathing holes. His body overheats in the armor despite the October cold, sweat soaking his padding, dripping into his eyes. He's terrified, but doesn't have time to process the fear. A French knight breaks through the line next to Edmund, and Edmund pivots to engage. They fight hand to hand, too close for the poleaxe, so Edmund drops it and draws his sword. They half-sword against each other, both trying to thrust into gaps, both blocking with blades and gauntlets. The fight is brief, brutal, intimate. Edmund sees the other knight's eyes through his visor slit, sees the same exhaustion and terror that Edmund feels. They grapple, stumble in the mud, fall together with Edmund on top. Edmund gets his dagger out, finds the gap at the armpit where the arm harness meets the breastplate, and forces the blade in deep. The French knight screams inside his helmet, a muffled sound, and tries to push Edmund off. But Edmund stays on top, working the dagger, cutting arteries, and the French knight's struggles weaken and stop. Edmund rises, retrieves his poleaxe, returns to his position in the line. The battle continues. Edmund doesn't know how long. An hour, maybe two. Time becomes meaningless. Just a continuous present of combat. His body moves automatically, trained responses taking over when his conscious mind is too exhausted to think. He sees King Henry fighting in the line near him, recognizable by his royal heraldry, fighting as desperately as any common soldier, his own life on the line just like everyone else's. This is not how kings fight in tournaments. This is not ceremonial. Henry is in the press of combat, killing and being attacked, bleeding from minor wounds, his crown-decorated helmet dented from strikes. Edmund feels a strange moment of something like love for his king, seeing Henry risk everything alongside his men. Then there's no time for feelings, because another French knight is trying to kill him, and Edmund has to fight, has to survive, has to keep moving because stopping means dying. The battle reaches some kind of turning point that Edmund doesn't fully perceive at the moment. The French advance slows, stops, begins to reverse. The French knights still standing begin to retreat, trying to disengage, trying to withdraw from the killing ground. The English don't let them. This is where battlefield combat diverges most completely from tournament combat. In tournaments, you let defeated opponents yield and withdraw. On battlefields, you pursue and kill routing enemies because an army that escapes intact can reorganize and fight again. The English men-at-arms and archers swarm forward, chasing French knights who are now trying to flee, pulling them down from behind, killing them methodically. Edmund participates in this pursuit, and this is the part of combat he hates most. The part that makes him feel least like a knight and most like a butcher. Killing men who are fighting back is one thing. Killing men who are trying to run, who are surrendering, who are begging for mercy, that's different. That feels like murder, not combat. But Edmund does it anyway because those are the orders, because that's what survival demands, because an enemy who escapes might kill you tomorrow. He helps pull down 3 French knights in the pursuit. All 3 are killed quickly with daggers through armor gaps. None of them die cleanly or quickly enough. One takes a dagger to the gut and screams for several minutes before blood loss takes him. Another takes a thrust through his aventail that severs his windpipe and he chokes and drowns in his own blood while making sounds Edmund knows he'll hear in his nightmares. The third surrenders in French, offering ransom, begging for mercy in a noble accent that suggests he's worth significant money. But English soldiers kill him anyway because King Henry has ordered that no prisoners be taken today. The order is controversial, arguably violates chivalric law, but Henry's reasoning is pragmatic. The English are still outnumbered, still in enemy territory, and can't spare soldiers to guard prisoners who might break free and attack from behind if the battle resumes. So the prisoners are killed, all of them. Hundreds of French knights who might have been ransomed for fortunes are instead murdered methodically, held down by English soldiers while daggers find gaps in their armor. Edmund witnesses executions of perhaps 20 prisoners, participates in 3 of them, and feels something inside himself break slightly with each killing. This is not the glory and honor that justified years of training and the enormous expense of equipment. This is just killing efficient and ugly, and done not because it's honorable, but because it's militarily expedient. The French army breaks completely by early afternoon. Those who can run, those who can't are killed or, despite Henry's orders, taken prisoner by soldiers who value ransom money more than they fear royal punishment. The battlefield is a wasteland of bodies, wounded horses screaming, trampled equipment, and mud churned to soup by thousands of feet and hooves. The English have won against impossible odds because Henry chose his ground well and because English longbows massacred French cavalry before they could engage. The English men-at-arms fought well, but the real victors today are the archers. The common soldiers armed with longbows who killed thousands of French knights and broke their formations before those knights ever reached melee range. Edmund removes his helmet and vomits from exhaustion and horror. His arms shake so badly he can barely hold his poleaxe. He's soaked in sweat and blood, his armor dented and scraped, his body one massive bruise under the metal. He's alive. Against all probability, against reasonable expectation, he survived. Around him, other English soldiers are in similar condition, exhausted, traumatized, unable to quite believe they're still breathing. The casualties are being counted. The English lost perhaps 400. The French lost thousands, perhaps 10,000, with most of the losses coming from the nobility, the knights who formed the core of French military power. It's a catastrophic defeat for France, a miracle victory for England, and Edmund feels none of the glory he felt at winning tournaments. He just feels tired and sick and grateful to be alive. Edmund sits on a fallen log at the edge of the battlefield as the sun begins to set on October 25th, 1415, and he cannot reconcile what he's just experienced with anything he was taught about knighthood. Around him, English soldiers are stripping armor and valuables from French corpses, a practical necessity because the English army is desperately undersupplied and because armor this good is worth a year's wages for a common soldier. The work is grim and methodical. You roll a body over, check for signs of life, and finish anyone still breathing because wounded enemies are dangerous. Then you begin the process of removing their armor piece by piece, checking pouches and pockets for coins or jewelry, taking their weapons if they're of good quality. He's entitled to a share of the spoils by right of his participation in the battle. But he can't make himself stand up, can't make himself approach the bodies of men he helped kill and reduce them further by stealing their possessions. His squire Thomas is out there somewhere doing the work, collecting equipment that will become Edmund's property. But Edmund himself just sits and stares at nothing in particular and tries to understand what he's become. He's a knight. He's been trained since childhood in the arts of war, in the techniques of armored combat, in the codes of chivalry that supposedly govern how knights behave. And today he helped massacre thousands of men, many of them after they'd surrendered, many of them while they were trying to flee, many of them in ways that violated every principle of honorable combat he was ever taught. He did what was necessary for survival. He followed orders. He fought as well as he could, and he lived when thousands died. but he feels contaminated, marked, changed in ways that he suspects will never fully heal. The physical damage is significant but manageable. Edmund has bruises covering most of his body from impacts. His armor absorbed but couldn't completely disperse. His right shoulder is badly strained from the repetitive motion of using his policies for hours. His hands are torn and blistered inside his gauntlets from gripping weapons. His feet are raw from walking and fighting in armor that shifted slightly with each step, rubbing his skin through his socks and shoes. He has a cut on his left forearm where a French knight's dagger found a gap in his armor during grappling. Not deep enough to be dangerous, but deep enough to require bandaging and attention. He likely has a mild concussion from at least 2 strikes to his helmet that rang his skull like a bell and left him dizzy and disoriented for minutes afterward. His body will heal from all of this. Knights train their entire lives to absorb this kind of punishment, and Edmund's body knows how to recover from the physical trauma of combat. In a week, maybe 2, his bruises will fade, his strains will heal, his cuts will close, and his body will be ready to fight again if necessary. But Edmund knows from experience that the psychological damage takes longer to heal, if it heals at all. He's been carrying the faces of the 2 men he killed in previous battles for years now. They visit his dreams regularly. They appear sometimes when he's trying to focus on other things. Sudden, intrusive memories of their eyes looking at him through visor slits, of the sounds they made while dying, of the specific physical sensations of pushing steel through armor gaps into flesh. And today he added at least 6 more faces to that collection. Maybe more if you count the men he helped kill rather than killing directly. 6 men whose faces he saw, whose deaths he caused, whose final moments he witnessed. He knows their faces will join the others in his nightmares. He knows he'll spend years carrying them, and there's nothing he can do about that except endure it. This is the reality that movies never show, never even hint at. Movie nights fight and kill without psychological consequence. They walk away from battles having killed dozens of enemies, and they're unchanged by the experience. They don't have nightmares. They don't flinch at sudden noises. They don't struggle with intrusive memories or guilt, or the slowly accumulating weight of having ended human lives. Movie nights kill as casually as a farmer harvests wheat, and then they move on to the next scene, the next adventure, the next battle, with no indication that killing other human beings has any psychological cost at all. But real warriors, Edmund included, pay enormous psychological prices for combat. The ancients knew this. Greek writers described warriors returning from war changed, haunted, unable to reintegrate into peaceful society. Medieval chronicles occasionally mention knights who became reclusive or unstable after particular battles, though they don't have the vocabulary to describe what we'd now call post-traumatic stress. And Edmund, sitting on his log watching the sunset over a field covered with thousands of corpses, knows he's been damaged again today. Knows that whatever part of himself he managed to preserve through his previous battles has been further eroded by what he did and saw at Agincourt. He wonders sometimes if there's a limit, a point at which you've killed so many men and witnessed so much violence that something essential breaks permanently, and you can never return to being fully human. He's seen older knights who have that look, that distance in their eyes, that inability to connect emotionally with anything that isn't violence. He's terrified of becoming that, of having violence become the only thing that feels real, of losing the capacity to value life, including his own. Thomas finds him as the light fades and brings Edmund a share of the collected equipment: 2 French daggers of good quality, a purse containing 30 gold coins, a decorated sword belt, and most valuably a nearly intact set of French plate armor that fits Edmund well enough that it can be used with minimal adjustment. This is a fortune, easily £200 sterling worth of equipment and coin, enough to live comfortably for years if Edmund manages it carefully. Thomas expects Edmund to be pleased, and expects congratulations for gathering such valuable salvage, but Edmund just nods and thanks him with words that sound hollow even to himself. Thomas is young enough, has seen little enough combat, but he's still capable of being excited about victory and plunder. Edmund envies that innocence even as he knows it won't last. Thomas killed his first man today, a wounded French knight that Thomas finished with a dagger to the throat. Edmund watched it happen. He saw the moment that Thomas's excitement about being in a real battle transformed into horror at what battle actually means. Thomas vomited afterward, just like Edmund did the first time. In a few years, if Thomas survives, he'll be sitting on a log after a battle feeling exactly what Edmund feels now. That's how it works. You don't get better at processing the psychological trauma of killing. You just get more experienced at carrying it, at functioning despite it, at appearing normal when you're anything but. The English camp that night is subdued, despite the incredible victory. There's no celebration, no revelry, none of the joyful chaos that typically follows a won battle. Part of this is exhaustion. Everyone is simply too tired to celebrate. But part of it is the awareness that what happened today was something unusual, something that violated the normal rules of warfare. The English slaughtered French nobility on a scale that hasn't been seen in living memory. They executed prisoners in defiance of chivalric law. They won through tactics that emphasized common archers over noble knights, which is pragmatically successful but philosophically disturbing to the social order that places knights at the top of the military hierarchy. Edmund eats a small meal and then lies down fully clothed on his bedroll, too tired to bother removing anything except his boots. He expects nightmares, but when sleep finally comes, it's dark and dreamless. The sleep of absolute exhaustion. His body has reached the limits of what it can endure, and it simply shuts down for 10 hours of unconsciousness that's closer to coma than normal sleep. He wakes with the dawn of October 26 to find his body almost completely immobile from stiffness and pain. Every muscle is locked. Every joint refuses to bend. It takes him 20 minutes of careful movement and stretching before he can stand and walk. And even then, his body protests every motion. This is normal. This happens after every battle. His body will gradually unlock over the next few days, and by the end of the week he'll be mostly functional again. But right now he feels approximately 90 years old, and he understands why knights typically retire from active combat by their 40s. The cumulative damage to the body, the repeated trauma, the constant injuries that never quite heal completely. It all adds up until even the strongest warrior simply can't continue. Edmund thinks about tournaments again as he forces his protesting body to move through the camp. He thinks about how different the aftermath of tournaments was from the aftermath of Agincourt. After winning the tournament at Westminster, Edmund spent the evening at a feast, accepting congratulations, drinking wine, flirting with Lady Catherine, basking in the respect and admiration of his peers. His body hurt from the day's combat, but it was good pain, earned pain, the satisfying ache of muscles used well in successful competition. He slept well that night, and woke feeling like he'd accomplished something meaningful, like he'd proven his worth as a knight and earned his place in the martial aristocracy. The tournament made him feel larger, more capable, more confident in his identity and his value. Agincourt has done the opposite. Agincourt has made Edmund feel smaller, dirtier, more aware of his mortality and his fundamental insignificance in the grand movements of history. He survived a major battle through a combination of skill, luck, and the tactical decisions of his king, and his reward for surviving is the knowledge that he's killed more men, accumulated more psychological trauma, and moved one step closer to whatever breaking point awaits him if he continues this life. The battle has eroded it, and Edmund understands now, in a way he couldn't have understood before experiencing both. The tournaments exist to create the illusion that warfare is noble, that violence can be controlled and made meaningful, that knights are heroes rather than just professional killers serving political interests they barely understand. The truth that movies never tell you, the truth that Edmund now knows in his bones, is that knights were not the heroes of medieval warfare. Knights were expensive, highly trained military assets that generals deployed when terrain and circumstances made armored cavalry or armored infantry tactically useful. Sometimes knights were decisive. Often they were irrelevant or actively counterproductive. At Agincourt, English longbowmen were the decisive arm. The men-at-arms like Edmund were important for holding the line once the French reached them, but the actual killing that won the battle was done by common soldiers armed with longbows, men who trained since childhood to draw heavy bows and whose massed arrow fire could kill horses and wound knights at ranges where the knights couldn't effectively respond. The chivalric culture that Edmund was raised in, the culture that values mounted knights as the pinnacle of military evolution, that culture is becoming obsolete, even as Edmund watches. Longbows are cheaper than armor. Training an archer takes less time than training a knight. 100 archers cost less than one fully equipped knight and his war horse. And at Agincourt, those 100 archers proved more militarily effective than the knight. Edmund knows this means something for the future of warfare. Something about the declining relevance of his entire social class, but he's too tired and traumatized to think through the implications right now. He just knows that the world is changing, that the military dominance of armored cavalry is ending, and that whatever comes next probably won't value the skills he spent his life developing. The English army begins the march back toward Calais on October 27th, moving slowly because everyone is injured or exhausted, or both. Edmund walks with his company of men-at-arms, his armor packed on a baggage wagon, because no one can march in full harness after fighting in it for hours 2 days ago. The march takes a week, and during that week Edmund has time to process what happened at Agincourt, time to begin integrating the experience into his understanding of himself and his profession. He talks with other knights and men-at-arms, and he discovers that everyone is struggling with similar questions, similar guilt, similar awareness that what they did violated the chivalric codes they were raised to honor. The execution of prisoners particularly bothers many of the knights. Yes, King Henry ordered it. Yes, there were tactical reasons. Yes, keeping prisoners would have been dangerous. But killing surrendered enemies is murder by the standards of chivalric law. And everyone who participated in those executions knows they've compromised their honor, knows they've failed to live up to the ideals that supposedly separate knights from common brigands. Edmund finds some comfort in discovering that he's not alone in his guilt, that other men are equally troubled, that this is a shared moral crisis rather than a personal failing, that the comfort is limited because shared guilt is still guilt. And knowing that other men also have nightmares doesn't make Edmund's nightmares less frequent or less intense. They reach Calais on November 3rd and board ships for England on November 5th. The crossing is rough, the November sea cold and angry, and Edmund spends most of the voyage being violently seasick, which at least distracts him from thinking about the battle. They land at Dover on November 7th, and Edmund is back on English soil for the first time in months. And the relief is overwhelming. He's survived. He's home. The campaign is over. He won't have to fight again immediately. The army disperses, soldiers returning to their homes or their garrison posts, and Edmund travels back to his family's manor in Kent, a week's ride from Dover. He arrives home on November 14th, 50 pounds heavier in equipment and coin than when he left, carrying wounds both visible and invisible, changed in ways that his family will notice but probably not understand. His father, too old now for campaign service, but a veteran of earlier wars, looks at Edmund's face and knows immediately what Edmund has experienced. There's a look that combat veterans have, a distance in the eyes, a way of moving through the world with constant awareness of threat, and Edmund's father recognizes it because he has that look himself. They don't talk about it much. Medieval men don't have vocabulary for discussing psychological trauma, don't have any framework for processing it except drinking and prayer, and the hope that time will fade the memories. Edmund's mother fusses over his physical injuries, makes sure his cuts are properly treated, feeds him enormous meals to restore the weight he lost during the campaign. His younger siblings ask excitedly about the battle, wanting to hear stories about glory and heroism, and Edmund gives them edited versions that leave out the executions and the screaming and the intimate brutality of killing men with daggers. He tells them about the English victory against impossible odds, about King Henry's leadership, about the courage of English archers. He doesn't tell them about the French knight who cried for his mother while bleeding out from a dagger thrust to the gut, or about the prisoner whose face Edmund held in the mud until he drowned, or about the hours spent killing men who were trying to run away. Edmund spends the winter at home, recovering physically and trying to recover psychologically. His body heals well. By December his bruises are gone, his cuts have closed, his strains have resolved. He can move normally again, can work with weapons, could fight again if he had to. His mind heals more slowly. The nightmares are intense and frequent. He wakes multiple times per night from dreams of combat, dreams of being trapped in armor while enemies attack, dreams of the faces of men he's killed. He's irritable and short-tempered in ways that are unlike his normal personality. He startles easily at sudden noises. He has trouble concentrating on normal activities because part of his mind is always running threat assessments, always scanning for danger, always prepared for violence, even though he's in his family home surrounded by peace and safety. His father recognizes all of this, sits with Edmund sometimes and talks about his own experiences in earlier campaigns, validates that what Edmund is experiencing is normal for warriors, that it gets easier with time even if it never completely goes away. This helps somewhat, knowing that what he's experiencing has a name, has a history, that other men have felt this way and survived it, makes it slightly more bearable. But only slightly. Edmund still lies awake many nights wishing he'd chosen a different path, wishing he'd become a clerk or a priest or a merchant, any profession that doesn't require killing other human beings and carrying their faces in your memory forever. But he's a knight. This is what he was born to be, what he was trained to be from age 7, what his entire identity is built around. He can't simply stop being a knight any more than he can stop being his father's son. This is who he is, for better or worse, and he has to find a way to live with what that means. The movies. Edmund thinks sometimes during those long winter nights, the stories that traveling minstrels tell about knights and battles, they're all lies. Not complete lies, not pure fabrication, but lies of omission that leave out everything that matters. The stories tell you about the glory and honor and courage, about noble knights fighting for their kings and their ladies, about chivalry and virtue and righteous combat. They don't tell you about the smell of battlefields, about how human bodies smell when they're opened by weapons, about how blood has a taste when it gets in your mouth, about how men shit themselves when they're dying, about how the screaming sounds, about how heavy a sword gets after you've been swinging it for 20 minutes, about how your arms shake with exhaustion, about how you'll vomit from fear before battle and from horror after it, about how you can't wash the blood out from under your fingernails for days afterwards, about how you wake up at night feeling like there are hands around your throat even though you're alone in your bed. The stories tell you that being a knight means something noble, that violence in service of your king is virtuous, that killing for your country is honorable. But Edmund knows now that violence is just violence, that killing is just killing, that there's no amount of noble justification that makes driving a dagger into another man's throat while he begs for mercy feel like anything except murder. The stories exist to recruit young men into knighthood, to make them aspire to martial glory, to convince them that spending their youth learning to kill and their adulthood actually doing it is somehow meaningful and good. And the stories work. Edmund believed them as a boy. He desperately wanted to become a knight, to win tournaments, to fight in battles, to earn glory and honor and recognition. And now he is a knight, and he has fought in battles, and he knows that everything the stories promised was false. There is no glory in killing. There is no honor in murder. There is only survival and trauma and the slow accumulation of psychological damage that you carry until it breaks you or you die. But Edmund also knows, sitting in his family home by the fire on a cold December night, that the stories will continue, that boys will continue to believe them, that the cycle will perpetuate itself generation after generation because civilization needs warriors, and the only way to get warriors is to lie to children about what warfare means, to dress up violence in pageantry and honor and noble purpose, so that young men will volunteer to destroy themselves in service of political interests they don't control and barely understand. Edmund has a younger brother, Thomas, named after Edmund Squire, who is currently 11 years old and beginning his training as a squire. Thomas is learning the same techniques Edmund learned, practicing with sword and lance, dreaming of tournament glory and battlefield heroism. Edmund watches Thomas practice and wants desperately to tell him the truth, to warn him that the life he's aspiring to is nothing like the stories promise, that being a knight means carrying faces in your nightmares and guilt in your gut, and the knowledge that you've killed men who were someone's sons and brothers and fathers. But Edmund doesn't say anything because what would be the point? Thomas has no other options. He's a second son of a knightly family. He can't inherit land. He can become a knight, or he can become a priest. And Thomas has no calling for the church, so knight he will be. And maybe, Edmund thinks, maybe Thomas will be lucky. Maybe he'll fight in fewer battles, maybe he'll survive without becoming as damaged as Edmund feels. Maybe the wars will end and Thomas will spend his career in tournaments rather than on battlefields. Maybe. Probably not. But maybe. So Edmund lets Thomas keep his illusions, lets him believe the stories, lets him train with enthusiasm and optimism that will be ground down eventually by the reality of combat, but which for now makes Thomas happy and gives his life direction and purpose. And Edmund himself continues being a knight because that's what he is. That's what he knows how to do. That's the only skill he has that's valued by his society. He'll recover from Agincourt. He'll train again. He'll fight again if King Henry requires it. He'll add more faces to his collection of nightmares, and more scars to his body, and more damage to his mind. He'll do this because he's a knight, and this is what knights do, regardless of what the stories say about glory and honor. The truth is that knights survive, that they carry their trauma, that they function despite their damage, that they do their duty even when their duty requires them to become monsters in the service of their king. And the movies will never show you this truth because this truth doesn't make for entertaining stories. Movies need heroes and villains and clear moral frameworks where good triumphs over evil and violence is a tool that heroes use righteously to protect the innocent. But medieval warfare had no heroes. Just traumatized survivors and the dead. Just men doing terrible things to other men for reasons they often didn't fully understand. Just violence that served political purposes and destroyed everyone it touched, regardless of which side they fought for. Edmund knows this now. He'll carry this knowledge for the rest of his life, however long that is, and he'll never watch a tournament again without seeing the lie it represents. The pretty fiction that violence can be controlled and made meaningful. The performance that exists to maintain the illusion that knighthood is about something more than just organized, state-sanctioned killing. The fire burns low in the hearth, and Edmund should add more wood, but he doesn't move. He just sits and stares at the coals and thinks about the French knight whose face he held in the mud, about how young the knight was, probably younger than Edmund, about how he struggled and then stopped struggling, about how Edmund felt nothing while it happened except a grim determination to survive. Edmund wonders if that knight had a brother like Thomas, had parents waiting for news that will never come, had a girl somewhere who gave him her favor before he rode off to war. Edmund will never know. He doesn't even know the knight's name. He's just one more face in the collection, one more ghost that visits Edmund's dreams, one more piece of proof that knighthood is nothing like the stories promise. And someday, maybe years from now, maybe decades if Edmund is unlucky enough to live that long, Edmund will die, and the faces will die with him, and no one will remember the men Edmund killed except maybe their families who will have been told some sanitized version of how their sons or brothers or fathers died honorably in battle. The truth of what actually happened, the mud and the screaming and the intimate brutality of armored combat, that truth will die with Edmund's generation of warriors, and the next generation will learn the same lies and make the same mistakes and discover the same truths too late to matter. That's how it works. That's how it's always worked. The stories lie, the warriors die, the cycle continues. And somewhere in a tent or a manor or a castle, a boy is dreaming of, and he has no idea what he's actually aspiring to. And no one will tell him until it's too late and he's killed his first man and realized that he's been preparing his entire life to become something he'll spend the rest of his life trying to forget he is. But you, lying safe and warm in your bed, you're not that boy. You're not training for violence. You're not preparing to kill. You don't have to carry the weight that Edmund carries, that medieval knights carried, that every warrior in history has carried. You get to know the truth without paying the price for learning it. You get to understand what knightly combat really meant without having to live through it, without having to become the kind of person who can drive a dagger into another person's throat and keep functioning afterward. You're safe. Your armor is your blanket, protecting you not from weapons but from cold. Your battlefield is your mattress, and the only thing you're fighting is insomnia. Your enemy is wakefulness, and you're winning. Your eyelids growing heavy, your body relaxing, your mind finally quiet enough to rest. You don't have to stand watch tonight. Someone else is keeping the watch. Somewhere in the world, someone is vigilant so you can sleep. That's how civilization works. Some people carry the burden of violence so that others don't have to, and you're in the category that doesn't have to, and you should be grateful for that, even as you remember that the people who do carry that burden pay enormous prices for your safety. Sleep now. Let go of Edmund's faces, Edmund's guilt, Edmund's trauma. Those belong to him, not to you. You just needed to understand the truth for a little while, needed to see behind the Hollywood lies and the romantic stories to what knighthood actually meant. Now you know. Now you can rest. The knights fought so you could sleep safely. Honor them by sleeping well. The watch is covered. The walls hold. The night passes, and morning will come again, as it always does, bringing light and warmth and the possibility of days without violence. Sleep. Rest. Dream peaceful dreams that Edmund never will. You've earned it, simply by being born in a time and place where armored combat is history, rather than daily reality. So let history fade into sleep. Let the past release you, and rest.